Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on preparing your business for Brexit, brought to you by MSL Solution Providers in partnership with Cosmetics Business and Cosmetics Cluster UK. My name is Julia Ray. I am Technical Editor at Cosmetics Business, and it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Alex Fotheringham, Operations Director Cosmetics, and Regulatory Team Leader Luke Fenn. Now, I'm sure we are all, Brexiteers, Remainers and Europeans alike, highly interested in their advice on how we can get our houses in order in advance of Brexit on the 31st of January. This is, of course, not the first Brexit date we've been teased with in the past 12 months, but all signs are pointing to next Friday being the actual day that Britain will exit Europe, which makes this webinar highly timely. So before we get started, there are some housekeeping items I should mention. This webinar will be available after the session on demand for those who want to listen to it again or share it with their colleagues. We encourage you to send in comments and questions for Alex and Luke to answer digitally after the presentation. So if you do have any questions, please type them into the Q&A chat box on your screen. That said, I will now hand over to Alex and Luke for some well-needed advice on Brexit.
Thank you, Julia. My name's Alex Fotheringham. As Julia said, I'm the Operations Director in charge of the cosmetics function at MSL, and I'm going to talk today a little bit about the possible political outcomes from Brexit. Obviously, a lot has changed since we were talking about Brexit in recent workshops around the country at the end of last year. I'm then going to talk about what are the possible impacts on the cosmetic regulation, and then Luke's going to talk about REACH and some other regulatory impacts to be aware of as we move forward into this time of significant uncertainty. So I want to start by introducing ourselves and explaining a little bit about why we're particularly interested in Brexit and why it has such a large impact on not only our business, but on the businesses of the clients we work for. So myself and Luke work for MSL Solution Providers, and we're a regulatory consultancy and microbiological testing laboratory, primarily in cosmetics and also some work in biocidal products. Now, one of our main services is acting as European responsible person, which we do for about 200 brands, and we have about 8,000 products under management on our CPMP portal entity. Now, obviously, we're a UK-based company, and with Brexit on the horizon, it was clear that the UK was no longer going to be able to fulfil the requirements for companies to act as responsible person from a UK base. With that in mind, about 2.5 years ago now, we began the process of moving some of our RP responsibilities to Ireland and preparing as much as we could for Brexit. And now we're really trying to work together with other organisations to provide clear guidance on how best to be prepared for Brexit. With that in mind, this presentation is presented alongside the Cosmetics Cluster UK and the Brexit Readiness Fund, so hopefully we'll be able to give you some clear advice on what to do so you can be prepared for the next 12 months. So the first thing to understand is really where are we politically. A lot has changed over the last 3 months, but particularly since just before Christmas, a huge amount has changed in the political landscape of the UK, and that understanding that is going to set us up to understand what's likely to happen in the future. The most recent developments, and I'm sure all of us are aware, but on the 12th of December, the UK had a general election, and I think in a relatively unlikely move, the Conservative Party actually secured a very large majority. And that has a huge impact on what's going to happen with Brexit. Because before Christmas, before the general election, the Conservatives had attempted to push Brexit through several times, but had struggled because they had lost their parliamentary majority when there was a general election with Theresa May as Prime Minister. Now, what the new look Parliament in the UK has the ability to do now, which it didn't used to, is actually push through the Brexit withdrawal bill in its entirety. And they actually succeeded to do that, and the final vote on the 9th of January won with a comfortable majority. The Conservatives are able to win any vote now with only Conservative votes. The next big timeline piece is that the UK will leave the European Union on the 31st of January at 11 p.m. But that doesn't mean that everything will change on day one. There are still several possible outcomes after that which we need to understand. So there are still two things that can happen straight away. The most likely is that the withdrawal agreement bill is accepted by the UK Parliament, the UK House of Lords, and by the European Parliament. We're currently just going through the process of acceptance in the UK, and there's been several amendments to that bill, but there's been no signs that any part of that bill will struggle getting through the UK legislative procedure. It's also extremely likely that the bill will be voted through by the European Parliament. Europe have spent years negotiating this bill with the UK, and I see no signs that they have any intention of making it fall at the final hurdle. But it is still possible. If the European Union vote down the withdrawal agreement bill, then we would actually have a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of January. The only option that's been completely taken off the table is a remain no Brexit option. It was clear in the general election that there was no appetite from the general public to remain, and that is effectively off the table. Now, the most likely outcome happens, and we have the withdrawal agreement bill, and the UK leaves the European Union on the 31st of January. Then we're in a transition period, and there are still two possible outcomes. So it is still possible that we have a no deal even after the withdrawal agreement is agreed. If we are unable to negotiate a trade agreement with the European Union, then we will have a no deal, and we will have to be prepared for that around December 2020. Or, more likely, some kind of trade deal is decided, and we enter into that trade deal sometime in this year. Now, what that means is the most likely thing to happen is at the end of January. So the most likely thing to happen is that we'll be in the transition period from the end of January. That transition period is intended to run until the end of December this year, and the government have actually committed via an amendment to the withdrawal bill not to extend that transition period, but they still can. That amendment is a little bit of political manoeuvring. They still have the option to re-amend the bill and remove that so they're not tied to the restricted length of the transition period. But the maximum length of the transition period is 24 months. So either this will be decided in December 2020 or in December 2021. During that transition period, the status quo continues. So cosmetic products will continue to be governed by the European cosmetic regulation when they're sold in the UK, and compliance must be kept for that entire period. For that period, UK responsible persons will be acceptable, and there should be no change. What I will say is that is the official line. What we've already started to see as a company is that retailers, importers and distributors are beginning to say to cosmetic brands, UK responsible persons are no longer allowed. Now, that's not true, but it can be very difficult to argue if one of your key distribution partners is telling you they won't accept your products because they have a UK responsible person. But it's really important to understand that that is actually not correct, and that you are still allowed to act as your own responsible person based in the UK until the end of the transition period. So what we're going to talk about is based on the most likely scenario as we see it, and in our opinion the most likely scenario is that we have the withdrawal bill accepted, we enter into the transition period, and that the future trading deal does not involve direct regulatory alignment and mutual recognition. It seems very unlikely at the moment that the UK and the European Union will be able to agree to full regulatory alignment, so we have to assume that there's going to be some change and the UK will end up its own regulated territory, and that's the assumption we're going to work on today. Now, the most important regulation that governs cosmetic products is the European Cosmetic Regulation 1223/2009, and if the UK does become its own third country, it will no longer be governed by those rules automatically. So I want to talk today about what happens if we are no longer governed by that, and what might we be governed by in the future, and if you're a UK company who deals directly with Europe, how does this affect you? There are regulatory impacts all across the board in when or if we are no longer subject to the European Cosmetic Regulation. All aspects of the regulation have some reliance on where your entity is. Responsible person has to be an entity in the European Union. The notifications are carried out by that entity. Product information files are held by them. Your packaging has to contain a European entity's name and address. There may be some change to who is allowed to carry out cosmetic product safety reports, and there will certainly be a change in how your responsibilities are structured depending on how you use importers and distributors to help you get products into market. I'm going to talk through each of these individually. Prior to the most recent developments, the UK was fully prepared, or was working on preparing for a no-deal Brexit, as around November last year that looked like the most likely outcome. In order to do that, the UK drafted new UK-based legislation for all of the important regulations that are currently governed by Europe. And they did this by transferring all European legislation straight into draft UK legislation with some tweaks. They did the same for the UK cosmetic regulation as it is now, and in order to make it make sense in the UK, they effectively changed any reference from the community, meaning the European Union, to read the United Kingdom. This legislation is available, but currently, with us being in the transition period, there's no clear guidance on whether this will be the legislation they choose to go with, or will they actually fully draft a new cosmetic regulation. The likelihood is that, as cosmetics aren't an extremely prized industry for the UK, they won't spend time drafting a new UK legislation in full, and that actually the future UK legislation will look something like this transposed version. Several things were changed, but as I mentioned, almost all of them were just to reference a UK-based entity rather than a European-based entity, and including having a UK notification rather than an EU notification, as it is currently in the European Cosmetic Regulation. Probably the biggest impact is this change on who is allowed to be the responsible person. So currently under the European Cosmetic Regulation, your products need a European responsible person located in the European Union. That can be a UK entity, it can be someone in another European country, and they will act as responsible person for products sold all across Europe. If the UK does not achieve regulatory alignment with the EU, then we'll no longer fulfil that requirement. We will not be an EU member state anymore, we will no longer be in the community, and therefore UK responsible persons will no longer be able to act as EU responsible persons. What that means is that if you have a UK responsible person currently, you will also need a European responsible person based in another European member state, and if you have a European responsible person, you will need a UK-based responsible person for products sold in the UK. This is a very big change and results in what we typically see as dual RP labelling. So we would see a UK address and a mainland or Irish European address on the product label, effectively to cover all possible outcomes. Currently, the European CPMP is accessed by all responsible persons, including those in the UK. A UK version of the notification portal has been in development since it looked likely that a no-deal Brexit would happen, and at the moment there is no real clear detail on whether development of that system will continue, because until the detail in the trade deal is decided, then we won't know whether a UK notification is actually required. What has always been the plan for the European CPMP is that on the day the UK is no longer a member of the European Union, presumably that means after the transition period, not at the end of January, UK entities will be deactivated from that EU portal. And that will mean that you will no longer be able to access your EU notifications, although they still will exist. You won't be able to download them, edit them, or add new notifications to that entity. They'll do that because UK RPs are no longer legally fulfilling their requirements. And what that means is it's very, very important to make sure you have those notifications transferred to an EU entity before they are lost, before your entity is deactivated. Now, with us being in the transition period, that will probably not happen until December 2020, but it's not something that I would want to leave to the last minute. If we do go down the route of having multiple responsible persons, then the product information file must be held at both locations. So your UK responsible person would hold a UK product information file, almost certainly containing the same information as the product information file held by the European entity. Now, there is part of the cosmetic regulation requires the product information file to be held in the native language. Some European member states have already said that they will accept English language product information files, the Netherlands, Malta, and obviously Ireland. But if your European responsible person is going to be in another European member state, France or Belgium or Germany, then you will need to make sure that either you are able to translate your product information file into the local language, or that the local authorities will accept your English language PIFs. Translating all of the PIF file is not an easy task, particularly when you have technical information in there. So ideally, you would look for a European RP in an English language country, or one of the countries I mentioned who will accept English language product information files. There has been some talk about the impact on cosmetic product safety reports and whether UK-based safety assessors and safety assessors trained in the UK will be able to complete safety assessments and fulfil the legal requirements for safety assessor qualifications. Now, currently this is in discussion between member states, but almost all reasonable member states seem to accept that UK safety assessors don't suddenly become unqualified after the UK leaves the EU, and should continue to accept reasonably well-trained UK-based safety assessors as they did previously. I think this is probably a bit of a storm in a teacup. There's been a lot of talk about it, but currently safety assessors based in the US and in China and Hong Kong submit a large number of safety assessments for products sold in the EU, and there's very little record of those being pushed back. So I wouldn't expect anything to change, and I wouldn't be looking to change who carries out your safety assessments if you are already working with a UK safety assessor. There is obviously some impact on labelling. If you sell your product into Europe and it's manufactured in Europe, you currently don't have to say where it's manufactured. But if you sell your product into Europe and it's manufactured in the UK, after Brexit you may well have to say made in the UK on the label. So be prepared to have to change that. And likewise, if you're bringing product into the UK manufactured elsewhere, you may have to say made in France on the label where you didn't have to previously. And of course, there is still the change to the responsible person address. Probably one of the hardest things to track will be the change in responsibilities, where a European or UK-based entity would have products sold all across Europe, and the companies that imported those products from the UK into mainland Europe would previously be distributors because the products are already on the market. They will suddenly become importers, and that comes with it a whole range of additional responsibility, including the requirement to be the responsible person. Now, you don't want your distributors to suddenly become responsible person and for the products to suddenly become non-compliant. So it's really important to make sure you have all of your responsibilities clearly defined, and that your distributors and importers understand what their legal responsibilities are and are making sure that they are going to fulfill those, but they're not going to take on additional responsibilities that neither party were expecting after Brexit. I'm going to now explain exactly what might happen based on your particular scenario. So there are currently 4 different scenarios for cosmetics companies. Either you have a UK-based responsible person currently, or you have a European-based responsible person. And when I say European, I mean Europe without the UK in it. So let's say, for example, you have a UK-based responsible person or a French-based responsible person. Now, those 4 scenarios are: if you have a UK responsible person and you only sell in the UK, you have a UK responsible person and you sell in the UK and other European member states, you have a French responsible person and you only sell into non-UK European member states, or you have a French RP and you sell into the UK and into Europe. Depending on which of these scenarios applies to you, you have different things to change because of Brexit. Scenario 1 is fairly simple. If you're a UK-based company and you only sell your products into the UK, then all you have to do is wait for Brexit to be resolved. If there's a UK cosmetic regulation, you would have to comply with that, but you'll be able to do that under your UK-based entity. You may have to complete a notification on the UK CPMP, and the intention was that you would have 90 days to do that in the event of a no deal, so that timeline will probably still apply. That's fairly easy. The big thing that you lose is the flexibility to quickly and easily begin to sell your products into Europe. If you wanted to sell your products into Europe, you would then need a European responsible person. Scenario 2 is probably the one that most people in the UK currently sit in, and unfortunately it's probably the most complicated. So scenario 2 is you have a UK-based responsible person who holds your product information files and completes your notifications, and their information is on your product labels. That may be yourself or it may be a third party. But you sell products into the UK and all across Europe. Now, everything will change effectively. For your European sales, you will probably need to establish a European responsible person and add that European responsible person onto the packaging. You would still have to be prepared to comply with whatever UK legislation came after Brexit, and you would need to transfer all of your existing notifications over to the new European entity. There was initially no intention for Europe to provide a transition period for this work, so effectively you now have 12 months to get into a situation where you're ready for this, whatever happens. Scenario 3, very like scenario 1, except you have an EU RP and you only sell in the EU. Absolutely no action required. The European legislation isn't changing at all. What is changing is the UK's relationship to that legislation. So as long as you're not based in the UK, there is nothing to do. What it does mean, as with scenario 1, is it's much more difficult for you to suddenly begin selling into the UK. So bear that in mind if you're a UK company who has the UK on its horizons. Scenario 4, as a European-based RP, but selling into the UK as well as Europe, you will need to establish a UK responsible person and have that person's address on your packaging. You will have, the intention was, if we had a no deal, for there to be a 90-day grace period for notifications and a 2-year grace period for adding the RP address onto the artworks specifically. But you do have to have that done before the time we leave. The RP, actually having an RP mandated, doesn't fall into that transition period. The implication of all this is really that we would have some significant duplication of effort. We would end up with products notified in both the UK and in the EU, and that adds a lot of extra difficulty for supply chains, and it makes it much more difficult to make sure that everything is up to date and compliant. Now, what I will say is that I think we've been given a little bit of grace previously. Industry position has always been, if we're non-compliant when the UK leaves the European Union, that's simply because we didn't know what was going to happen. And I think the government stance is already starting to harden on this. What I expect will happen is that after the end of the transition period, they will say, you have had 3.5 years to prepare for Brexit, you've had 12 months after we've left to be prepared, and if you're not prepared, you won't be getting any leeway from the European government. And I suspect the same will be true from the European customs and border authorities. What that means really is that you have a really good period, 11 months now, to prepare your business for Brexit. And in my opinion, the best preparation you can make is make sure you have dual responsible person set up, that you have a structure for complying with the European legislation after the UK is no longer a European member state, and that you have a method to comply with whatever the future UK legislation will be. What we've done as a company in order to be prepared for this is set up an Irish subsidiary company under our UK entity and establish that company as an Irish responsible person. Almost all of our customers have both addresses on the labels, and for clients of ours who are their own UK responsible person but need an EU RP, then they would be their own UK and we would be the EU RP through the Irish address. We have currently actually nearly 8,000 products now transferred to the MSL Irish portal. So if we lose access to our UK-based entity, we won't lose all those notifications. And we have thousands of products agreed to be notified on the UK CPMP as and when it's available. And I think this level of preparation is really something that everyone needs to be doing over the next 12 months, so that you're not stung by the end of the transition period coming maybe quicker than we expected.
Hi there, I'm Luke Fenn. I'm the regulatory team leader at MSL. I'll be going through some of the consequences of Brexit on EU REACH and the proposed UK REACH system. Okay, so before we begin, I think it's worth just understanding the supply chain definitions within REACH, because that will be a lot of what I'm talking about, is understanding your position, how it could change in relation to Brexit, and then understanding your responsibilities. So under REACH, there are manufacturers, defined as natural or legal people established within the community who manufacture a substance within the community. Now it's worth remembering that these supply chain definitions will apply to both the EU and the UK. It's just that community on the EU side will mean the European Union, and for the UK it will just be the United Kingdom. So you've got importers, which again, natural or legal person established within the community who's responsible for import. Downstream user is a natural or legal person, again within the community, other than the manufacturer or the importer who uses a substance in the course of their professional activities. Now it's important to understand that consumers are not considered to be downstream users, and nor should they be after Brexit. Responsibility under REACH will always fall on the importer or the manufacturer. It's just that responsibility, your position, may change after Brexit. So distributors, again, are natural or legal people established within the community other than the manufacturer or the importer, who only stores and places on the market a substance for third parties. And again, they aren't considered downstream users. And then finally, similar to how you have the responsible person in the cosmetic regulation, there's the only representative function within REACH. That's a natural or legal person established within the community that is appointed by a non-EU manufacturer or formulator to undertake all REACH compliance obligations. Now, after Brexit, with UK REACH, it'll be any non-UK based manufacturer or legal person. Okay, so in essence, the consequences of Brexit on REACH would be the same goal, but two different systems running side by side to try and achieve it. So unless a permanent deal on regulatory alignment is included in the eventual UK-EU trade deal, then after the Brexit transition, the UK will be considered a third country under EU law and will no longer be considered as an active participant under EU REACH. Now, to prepare for that, the UK has passed the statutory instrument covering REACH in March 2019, which has created the proposed system known as UK REACH. Now, it's meant to function in much the same way as EU REACH. The principles of registration, where a substance is used at more than 1 tonne per annum, substances of very high concern, and the only representative allowance. Now, it is worth saying early on that industry on both the EU and the UK side have serious concerns about the viability of UK REACH. The administrative capabilities of the UK Health and Safety Executive that will be administering REACH under DEFRA are considerably less than ECHA, which is the European Chemicals Association. That's based in Helsinki, and that's been administering REACH for the past several years whilst it's been ongoing, but they have far more resources and a far bigger budget, so just on a purely practical level, there are concerns about how that will work. And finally, you'll have two systems running in parallel with increased costs and increased resources needed, but for no clear benefit in terms of trying to protect workers or the environment. So there is some disquiet about the whole point of having two different regulatory responsibilities that are just trying to reach the same goal. Okay, so post-Brexit, assuming we get the withdrawal agreement passed, then there will be no change until the end of the transition period in December 2020. So everyone will retain access to ECHA databases. UK companies and registrations will continue to be treated the same as any other EU member state. Now, industry is hopeful of a mini deal to ensure continued UK participation in EU REACH beyond 2020. There will of course be far less immediate burden on UK companies with the transition period, but you will really need to use the next 11 or 12 months to take action to prepare for both UK REACH and any changes that may occur for your position under EU REACH. Now, the most important things probably there would be understanding where the registrations lie for the substances that you use. We will cover that in more detail though on the next slides. Okay, so assuming there is a no-deal Brexit, which could still happen before the end of January, or as we've discussed already, it's more likely it could occur in January of 2021, then UK REACH will be implemented immediately, administered by the Health and Safety Executive under DEFRA. Now, the ECHA IT system will be replaced by the UK system known as Comply with UK REACH. Now, this system has not been seen yet. The rollout has been delayed a number of times by government as the Brexit deadline has been pushed back. It's still not clear what kind of capabilities would exist. It's one of the big unknowns really about how UK REACH will work, because the IT system is absolutely crucial in administering it properly. And then you'll have the cost and resourcing required to duplicate existing registrations in the UK system. So there will be a lot of additional manpower needed, even if it is purely administrative changes. The IT systems involved can be so complicated that there will be no quick and easy way of just data scraping from one system to the other, so far as we're aware. Now, returning back to what I said earlier about understanding the position of your registrations moving forward, if a UK-based entity held a substance registration under EU REACH at any time since the 29th of March 2017, then a grandfathering system will recognise this registration under UK REACH and significantly reduce the amount of data required for a new registration. Now, where a substance is being grandfathered, the UK entity has 180 days from Brexit to complete a simple notification on the new UK system, and 2 years to provide all required technical data. Now again, there's uncertainty around what level of technical data will be required. A lot of the studies that have been used in EU registrations may not be readily available for UK registrants. There may be significant costs involved, and there has been a lot of lobbying from industry to reduce the amount of information that the UK would require for substances that have already been registered on the EU REACH. So, in response to that partly, the HSE have announced they will implement a transitional light touch notification period for UK entities if you import a substance from an EU supplier that has not been grandfathered into the UK. So if it's something that has already been registered in the EU, but the registration wasn't within the UK, then the UK has confirmed they aren't going to take a tougher line. They will take the pragmatic approach that if it's been certified as safe under EU REACH, then there's no pressing need to start doing work under UK REACH. And it's important to note that it is unclear how long this transitional period will last, but the UK government are keen to minimise any supply chain disruption wherever they can, so it wouldn't be a huge surprise if that was really quite a long period, given that REACH is going to take probably years and years to fully clarify the position on both EU and UK sides. Okay, so UK companies, in the event of a no deal, will lose access to the ECHA databases and registrations, and they will then have to decide if they wish to retain market access. So there may well be in a situation after Brexit where companies on both sides, the EU and the UK, may decide that it isn't actually worth the resources involved to notify under both systems. Because a UK-based manufacturer, for example, would have no obligations under EU REACH. However, if no EU-based importer was willing to take over the registration, then their only option to continue selling their substance into the EU would be to appoint an EU 27 only representative, which again will come as a shock to some UK companies with the amount of data sharing that's involved and the registrations, the negotiations that have to go on. So I expect there will be a period of significant uncertainty where both sides decide if it is worth undertaking the obligations. So a UK-based registrant, however, can transfer the registration to an EU-based entity pre-Brexit to minimise the supply chain disruption. That would then allow the product to be just registered in the EU REACH and would allow for continued market access, but not from that UK entity. Again, there'll be a lot of shifting around with new roles within supply chains. We've got a couple of examples coming up. And if the EU authorities decide to take a proactive approach to immediate REACH enforcement, then you may see significant supply chain disruption where UK companies have not been aware of their responsibilities and could potentially just have their access to market barred immediately. Now, hopefully, because the UK have confirmed that they will be more lenient on EU-based registrations, the EU may choose to take a similar approach, but it's not clear. The EU have invested significantly in some countries in new border agents and things like that, so it may be that it's exactly for situations like this, so it won't be clear until we actually reach the situation. So this slide just summarises what I've been discussing over the past few slides, so I'm just going to leave that on screen for a few moments so that you can pick out the most applicable situation to yourself. Okay, so moving forward in terms of actions to take, we've tried to split it out into stages to help it be a little bit more manageable. So the most important thing to do to begin with is build an inventory of all the substances that you use so that you have a clear understanding of where you may have obligations under the registration aspect of REACH. Second, you should then identify any substances that you use or manufacture above 1 tonne per annum. Understand your position within the post-Brexit supply chain, and then you should conduct supply chain interrogation to understand where the registration was based before Brexit and if the intention is to continue market access to both the EU and UK market after Brexit. It may then be that you choose to switch suppliers wherever possible to ensure that you have registered substances under both systems and don't have to take any of the obligations yourself. Okay, so on screen is just a simple example of an inventory for your substances. Now, there's no set methodology for how to actually record this data, but it must demonstrate a reasonable attempt to obtain accurate information. The authorities don't have any set criteria, but if it's clear that you're miscalculating things to understate your true uses of substances, then I'm sure it wouldn't be looked on very favourably. So again, it's important to remember that the tonnage, although it's annual, doesn't necessarily have to run from the 1st of January to the 31st of December. It may be that you choose to do your inventories starting and ending at certain times of the year, depending on your particular supply chain and how much stock you hold at different times of the year. And be sure to try and split between UK and EU substances so that you can obtain correct figures for each territory and can check whether registrations have been carried out. Now, once you have your inventory, it's important to identify the substances that are present at more than 1 tonne per annum, because those are the ones that you really need to understand if anybody else is going to take on the obligations, or if you may have to do so under the new supply chain. So the next 3 slides just give examples of various supply chains and the implications post-Brexit. So rather than talk over them, I'm just going to leave them on screen so that you can have a look and identify which is most applicable to yourselves, and then understand the actions that you should take. Okay, so once you have your inventory of substances, you've identified where you fall over the tonne annum limit, and you understand your role within the supply chain, it then would be a good idea to do some supply chain interrogation so that you can approach suppliers or manufacturers to identify, 1, where the registrations exist pre-Brexit, and then if they intend to comply with the regulations post-Brexit. So you need to record this communication properly, whether it be electronic or via letter or phone call, and then wherever you receive confirmation that they do not intend to undertake REACH responsibilities or appoint an only representative to do so, you would have to decide whether to assume the responsibilities yourself or via an only representative, whether to switch to a compliant supplier or manufacturer, or whether to reformulate your products to avoid entirely having to use the substance in question. So to summarise, there is the potential of significant supply chain disruption after Brexit. However, just remain mindful of the goals of REACH. Although the processes and the IT systems can be extremely complex, the aims in terms of protecting substance users and the environment remain consistent across both regulations, so hopefully the authorities will be willing to work together across both UK and EU regulations to just make sure that that remains the prime aim. There is likely to be a period of uncertainty as both the UK and the EU authorities deal with the substantial increase in workloads that they will have. Will REACH be a priority? We may find that actually REACH currently isn't enforced particularly strongly across the EU. It may be that it's put on the back burner for the next couple of years or the next several years, while other more pressing matters are taken care of. Okay, so finally, we're just going to go through a few other areas that could be impacted upon by Brexit. So, imports and exports is the great unknown at this stage. There is the potential for significant disruption at port. The UK government believes that it has a system in place that will minimise any checks. The EU is more sceptical and doesn't see how that can happen, but at this point nothing is set in stone, so it is a case of just having to wait and see, but do be aware that there is a potential for substantial delays in trying to get products and raw materials in and out of the UK and from the EU into the UK. Okay, so GDPR came into force last year. The UK has indicated that it's going to continue to work under GDPR standards. Now, if you are doing business in the European Union, you have no choice but to comply with GDPR. So that does make sense to an extent, that so much of the business that is conducted in the UK is with EU companies. Rather than have two separate standards, we're just going to try and continue complying with GDPR. But again, it's unknown whether regulatory divergence could happen at some point in the future. And also tariffs. If we have a no deal, then WTO tariffs will apply. They are product dependent, but equally there may ultimately be tariffs under any free trade agreement that is agreed with the European Union. In terms of your workforce, for people living and working in the UK, if they're EU nationals, it's important to make sure that they apply for settled status in a timely manner so that they retain all rights post-Brexit. Same applies on the other side. Any UK nationals living and working in the EU will need to take steps to ensure that they are safe to continue living and working as necessary after Brexit. However, the standards do vary from country to country across the EU. Okay, so in terms of key takeaways, it's very important to understand how Brexit changes your regulatory responsibilities. You need to have appropriate contingency plans in place, and you need to secure your supply chain to ensure continuity of supply. And I think it's worth stating that the most important aspect moving forward in the short term will be to monitor the progress of the EU-UK trade negotiations. Everything that was in this presentation to some extent is based on prediction, and whilst that final free trade agreement hasn't been signed off, anything could still happen. So there is going to be responsibility on every individual company to keep up with what's going on and make sure that you take all appropriate steps. Okay, that concludes today's webinar. We hope you found it useful. Please submit any questions through the Q&A, and then if you have any questions that you think of at a later date, you can submit them via the email address on screen currently, and a member of staff will come back to you as soon as possible. Thank you very much.